Well, good morning and welcome to HSABC's webinar, Psychological Coping During the Coronavirus, Practical Strategies for Helping Clients Cope. My name is Sarah Kift and I'm your host for today. So that's the face to the voice that you're hearing. And when you're using the question section, that's me who you'll be chatting to. All right, so let's just get a sense of where everyone is at. Just let me know what your role is in your organization. And being a frontline worker myself in many different capacities, sometimes I've been all of these at the same time or switched between them depending on the day. And some of them were not necessarily in my job description, but I definitely a part of my job. So feel free to choose other and let me know in the question section what role you're currently doing right now. This just gives us a good sense of who's on the line and helps us to tailor our content for you today. All right, so we've got lots of managers and supervisors on the line today. Welcome. Thank you for joining us in the midst of your busy schedules and all the responsibilities you have. And we have a lot of frontline workers on the line. Thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for showing up, as well as some caseworkers and counselors. It's fantastic to have you. And the 13% includes people in a homeless prevention program, some volunteers, and some other people. So we're really glad that everybody is here today. This is my favorite part. I get to introduce Dr. Heather to you. Dr. Heather Fulton is a registered psychologist, and she's currently working as a supervisor of psychiatry resident psychotherapy training at Royal Columbian Hospital. She previously worked at the Burnaby Center for Mental Health and Addiction, as well as maintaining a private practice. And she still maintains her private practice. She has been studying, researching, and working in the area of concurrent disorders, particularly with vulnerably housed individuals, for over 15 years. She is also a past volunteer of the Calgary Drop-In and Rehab Center, a large facility in downtown Calgary that offers various levels of housing support, meals, essential health services, as well as employment training. And right now, Dr. Heather is joining us from her office, so she's also on the front lines, going to work every day. Thank you so much for being here, Heather. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I mentioned this last time, but I'm trying to remember to mention it right at the beginning. Since I am at a hospital, it is possible we might hear some sirens in the background. I'm also close to the helipad. So if the helicopter comes, our audio might be disrupted temporarily, but that's probably unlikely, so probably won't happen during our webinar today, but I wanted to mention it just in case. All right, let's get started. All right, so the agenda I have for us to talk about today is just, first of all, understanding what are the common reactions we might be expecting from the folks that we serve. And I also wanted to make it really unique to people who are experiencing homelessness and vulnerably housed individuals as well, because a lot of the resources that are out there are for just general population. And so I think that there's some unique factors for folks who are experiencing these challenges. Then we'll be focusing on, okay, well, what do I do, right? And what are some practical tips that really anybody can do, even though, as we know from the survey at the beginning, many of you have very different roles, you've got different training, different backgrounds. You know, this is 1 hour today. We're not going to make you all mini psychologists or counselors, nor might you even want that, but it's really figuring out what could be the best fit for you within the limits of your organization role and background, as well as how to best meet client needs. Of course, we'll spend some time looking at resources at the end, and then I want to leave quite a bit of time for Q&A as well for discussion. All right, so first of all, what kind of challenges might people be experiencing during pandemics? So of course, the most obvious one that people experience is a real fear of infection, illness, and dying. With people who are experiencing homelessness or vulnerable housing, this can often lead to people avoiding health services. So avoiding just, I don't want to know if perhaps I have this infection, or because the health services might actually increase my risk of getting infected. And it can also lead to quite a bit of anxiety because there's a risk of misinterpreting other common symptoms that people experience. So having a fever or a cough that misinterpreting that of, oh, well, this certainly means that I am now infected and I'm certainly going to die as a result. Obviously, if you think you're certainly infected and certainly going to die, that would cause you a whole lot of anxiety and fear and distress. People often during pandemic situations are really worried about exclusion due to their disease. I won't be able to access certain services that I actually need, or I'm going to be socially excluded and socially shamed for something. There also be a real fear of separation from loved ones. So I won't be able to see my partner or my child. They're so important to my recovery from substance use, recovery in mental health, but also fear of, am I going to be able to access other supports like safe injection sites or other healthcare providers and services like my harm reduction supplies that I really need, and fear of that, and a lot of terror really of just how am I going to be able to function during this time. Often people will feel real helpless, boredom, especially if they're isolating, loneliness and powerlessness. And this is really related to isolation, but even if someone's maybe sometimes adhering to that or not, during a pandemic situation, these are really common feelings. We also know that during these situations, there can be a deterioration of other physical and mental health conditions. And part of this is because often people have less access to their caregivers, whether those are social supports or family members that might be providing assistance, but also the lack of access to the typical health services. So they don't get those ACT team visits as often, or they're not able to access that drop-in clinic or those drop-in groups that were really supportive of their mental health or physical health in the past. We also know those isolation side effects, things like boredom, stress, loneliness, feeling helpless. Those really exacerbate someone's substance use disorder symptoms, their serious mental health symptoms, or just everyone. Our depression and anxiety can really increase just due to isolation alone. And of course, increased stress exacerbates physical health conditions, but of course, mental health conditions as well. And then it's also important to recognize with stress, with isolation, that someone where maybe they had alternate coping strategies, that they can have a lot of increased urges to use past ones. So perhaps you've been really stable in your recovery from a substance use disorder for many years. This increased stress, the novelty, the uncertainty, the prolonged nature of this pandemic can make it really triggering, where things that you thought you had kind of conquered or dealt with kind of pop up where it's, whoa, what the hell happened? I thought I was over that, or why have I had a craving now where I haven't had one for so long? Or the urges to say self-harm or binge eat or restrict eating. Those different coping strategies with different mental health conditions where maybe they were under control for a while can actually kind of come back more now during this time of increased stress. So the other important thing is to acknowledge, all right, so not only what are the challenges that the folks we serve, what are they facing, but then what are the challenges experienced as helpers as we try to help people navigate these challenges? I find often it falls into two different categories. The first is this person's very distressed. How do I help them feel better? They might be over responding to this threat, and maybe their behavior and their response to this threat, this anxiety or distress, it's affecting others at our service too, because fear can be so contagious. The other challenge often that people experience is this person is not distressed enough, right? They're under responding to this threat, in my opinion. And I'm frustrated because they seem to be making choices that are not in their best interest, like they're not social distancing, they're not practicing hygiene. And I am finding that really distressing to see. And how do I help them? So first of all, what we do is really going to be determined by how can we understand these people's different reactions so that we're in a better place to help. So someone's response to a threat and the level of distress that they feel, it's related to what kind of stressors they're experiencing in their life. So not just the coronavirus threat, but what else is going on. Is the risk of coronavirus actually the priority right now? It can be really helpful to think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs here. So many of you might be familiar already with this triangle. But what's really important here is most important for clients and really everybody is first and foremost is we need to know that physically we're okay. The possibility of an invisible maybe threat of corona, which maybe is a big deal or maybe it won't be, it can seem a whole lot less serious compared to the definite threat of bad withdrawal from substances, the definite threat of abuse from someone in your living situation, or the definite threat of not having money to buy your essentials. And those essentials can include things that some of us might consider to be luxuries, like, say, smokes, right? But those are not viewed the same way by folks who do use them regularly and have physical and psychological dependence on them. Next up on this list after those basic physiological needs are safety and security. And only after those basic needs are psychological needs and self-fulfillment. Those needs on the bottom are the most important and they need to get filled first. So when someone doesn't see something as important or as necessary, but we do, it can be really helpful to check our perspective. Am I making an assumption here about certain needs being filled when perhaps they're not? Current stressors can also include whether someone even knows someone with coronavirus or someone who's died related to that. That's going to affect someone's level of stress. And it also relates to whether someone sees themselves as vulnerable to coronavirus, like, say, someone who's immunocompromised or not. Other ways that someone's emotional reaction can vary is based on their past trauma experience. So past trauma affects this because some people have lived through outbreaks before. This might be protective, or maybe it might lead them to feeling even more scared. People who are experiencing homelessness also are abundantly familiar with rumors, paranoia, even extreme threats from social service providers or healthcare folks or others, like you will die if or when X happens kind of thing. But they've also survived these situations too. And so these kinds of experiences can lead to a whole lot of mistrust of healthcare providers or just information on the streets, like, do I really trust this information? People might also have a number of coping skills already from experiencing trauma that might be more or less helpful in the short term and long term, like denying there even is a threat or a problem, or shutting out everyone totally, or abandoning shelters and services and just going to isolated areas completely to avoid people. We can define trauma as a normal reaction to abnormal events. This is an abnormal event. So really, every reaction that people are having is a normal reaction. They all make sense. And this is not to say there's nothing we can do to help, but it is to get at, we can understand where each person is coming from, even though they might be vastly different in their responses, that really there's no right level of distress or way to respond during this situation. As you already probably know, current mental health also matters for how someone's going to be responding during this pandemic. For someone with a severe mental illness like psychosis, substance use, stress and isolation can make their symptoms much worse. Additionally, all of us habituate to risk. So we get used to certain risk levels. So we try something risky, and if nothing bad happens immediately, we tend to keep doing it. Like, I'm not supposed to go out or do this activity, yet I do. Nothing bad has really happened immediately yet. Maybe that risk isn't as great based on my experience, so then I keep doing it. I think it's also important here to mention cognitive functioning. So everybody's cognition or thinking skills is impacted by stress. So we all have trouble sustaining attention, concentrating, and remembering things when we're stressed out. Also, specific to corona and understanding this threat, it's really important to recognize that this threat, it's abstract, it's unseen, and that can be really hard to grasp. And it's certainly harder to grasp compared to, say, someone with a weapon, right? The threat is a bit different. Additionally, you need to have good organizational and planning skills to be able to plan supplies, plan your time if you're going to go under self-isolation, like planning your food, planning your outings. And everybody varies to the extent that they're able to do this. Often people who've had head injuries or learning disabilities might find this harder than others, and they need more supports to do this. We also know that head injuries and learning disabilities are really under-recognized and underdiagnosed in people who are experiencing homelessness. And another important factor is time. Is just because someone doesn't seem concerned right now, or maybe they seem really distressed right now, it doesn't mean that they're always this way, right? As you may have even experienced in your own life, we all go up and down with how we're reacting to this ongoing stressor over the day, week, and beyond. And lastly, I also want to mention that we often underestimate how much our behavior is influenced by others. So many of us might put on a brave or nonchalant face in public, but feel very differently about a situation. And in fact, when you're living on the streets, this brave face or this nonchalant, I'm not bothered by anything, actually is what helps keep you safe. People don't know if you're scared or what's valuable to you in order to take it or potentially manipulate you. So this can be a real survival technique. Conversely, potentially we might feel fine about something, but then we see someone else crack. We see someone else get distressed, and that can really shake us fundamentally. And a lot of emotions that maybe we were ignoring or kind of suppressing a bit can really come rushing in. All right, so what do we do, right? If we understand these reactions, we understand the variability, how can I help? So first, hopefully it's kind of been clear, is recognizing that all responses are reasonable and to be expected. And that doesn't mean as a service provider, you're going to tolerate abuse. Definitely, you're still going to have boundaries, right? And yet it's about recognizing that some reactions to you or your service may have nothing to do with you as well. It's not personal, it's about this situation. So then what you do in your organization, how you help with someone with their mental health, again, it's going to be mostly determined by what's your organization and your role. And this can be a bit challenging because often in shelter and homelessness services, we're used to doing just whatever is needed, being really creative, going above and beyond what we really have, right, in order to operate. But the limits, and there are limits and boundaries in your role and organization, like say just even time, right? Yeah, you might be a peer support counselor at your service, but how much time do you have right now in this moment to help someone individually, right? What you can actually do for a client, that's limited, right? You might have the best of intentions, the highest aspirations, but it's really much better to do one thing well consistently and be really transparent about it than to overpromise and underdeliver. As I'm sure you all know, folks who are homeless and vulnerably housed are particularly experienced in being let down by services, people in their lives, helpers. We don't want to further perpetuate that cycle of mistrust and disappointment. So we want to be really clear and transparent, right, with what can I offer, what am I offering here in this organization. And also knowing these limits and being clear in communication of these limits and boundaries can actually reduce anxiety. Yes, you may not be able to meet that need, but at least people know what to expect, right? They know what to expect from your service, and that can actually decrease their anxiety as well. The last thing I'm also going to mention with this, that particularly in the area of mental health, people can kind of have the impression of like, well, what's the harm? You know, anything is better than nothing. Let me just give this handout or workbook. Maybe I'm not a therapist, but it's better for them to have this self-help resource than not. And I'd really say is no, that's not necessarily the case. because anything that's really strong and powerful enough to make a change in someone's life, just like a medication, also carries risks of harm and carries risk of misuse. So, for example, people can also be inoculated against an intervention or help, right? I'm like, oh, I've tried that technique, I've tried this therapy, it didn't work for me. But they actually never got sort of a proper dose or exposure to that intervention. And so now they might be even more resistant or less likely to try that therapy or try that technique when actually they haven't given it they haven't received even the sort of full benefit. So we have to be really careful about what we offer and how we offer it. Okay, so what I do, it's going to be somewhat limited by my own training, my role and organization. But of course, what we do, what we're going to offer is also going to be majorly influenced by the client. And really this comes down to, what does the client want help with? What do they want and need? And this is going to be different from person to person because the mental and physical challenges they are experiencing during this pandemic are also very different. So for some people, it might be just meeting those most basic needs of food, a roof over my head, access to a place to wash my hands kind of thing, or continuing to foster a good relationship with someone so they stay connected to services. That may be the most important. Other people, it might be connecting them to a resource or sharing information that potentially might be helpful. But most important is, often we can assume that what people want is sort of filling of an information gap or problem solving, right? So as helping professionals, we want to help. We launch into fix-it mode. But I'd caution you a little bit on this, right? So let's just step aside for a second. Let's think about, have you ever had, say, a really stressful day? You're overwhelmed, you're frustrated. This might have even happened in the past week. You come home, you tell a loved one about it, and now they're launching into giving you all this information and plans for what you need to do next and to problem solve. Reflect, how does that often make you feel? And how do you tend to react? I think most of us have a pretty negative reaction. Sarah, were you going to say something?
No, I'm just even thinking about this morning with my kids and this last week, basically all of this quarantine, and trying to work it out.
Yeah, and our loved ones, they're giving us advice, they're giving us information with the best of intentions. But at least for me, in my experience, I'm typically like, oh, no, you're not listening. You don't get it, right? And so they're doing it. They want to fix it. They're feeling distressed because we're distressed, right? But the help that they're providing is actually not helpful. And so, again, it's really, even though we think we know what might be helpful for people, or the path is so clear to us of what would be helpful, is we really need to stop, slow it down. Have I actually asked them, what would be most helpful to you right now, right? Or what can I help? What do you need right now? Or it doesn't always have to be a question. I'm hearing this is what you really want right now, right? That is going to be most important. If you get anything from this webinar today, I hope that this is it, right? Is slow down and ask them what can be helpful, because often we launch into information giving and problem solving mode. But there's not always what is most helpful. I will caution though, sometimes when we ask people what is most important, what is their goal, we don't always get, say, an answer that we like, right? What I think is sometimes most important, what helpful for them, is not what they tell me is most helpful for them. And we have to respect people's expertise in their own life. And that they also are experts and they are really important. And if me just launching in on what I think is going to be most helpful for someone is almost never received as actually helpful, right? So we want to go with what the client's goal is.
It makes me sorry, yeah? I was just thinking about working in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and because we have such a strong mandate to provide space for people and healthy food, and we have all these goals as an organization, and then sometimes that's not what people want or need. But because we're so used to just giving those services in an emergency context, we kind of start to assume that we know more than they do, what they need in
Yeah,
that moment. And I've definitely been guilty of that myself.
yeah, yeah. And I think it can also be a challenge because sometimes what a client says they need is not what I'm actually able to give, right? If I actually don't have time to do that, or that's not within the scope of my service, right? Where then we have to also be clear and transparent of what are the limits of my role. Can I connect you with something? Maybe I can't. So it's listening to what is most important to the client and trying to deliver and meet those needs that way, but also recognizing sometimes is that we may be potentially not the right service necessary for that, but could we help them meet that need in a different way? So one other thing that is really important that we know from research in pandemics, how do the people who cope better or they fare better out of these situations, what's really important? And what we know from that research is the altruism is better than compulsion. People need to have agency, autonomy, and empowerment, right? If they are going to self-isolate, they're self-isolating because it's my choice. It's meaningful. It's helping others rather than feeling like I was compelled or trapped, right? People where they feel like they have that agency and autonomy, they do a lot better. They comply a lot better. They actually sort of go with those sort of public health guidelines, and they have less distress. And that's true really for any kind of behavior change, right? In terms of managing mental health, symptoms, substance use, people need to feel in control, right? So what does that mean for us as service providers in the homelessness sector? It means we need to give people or emphasize their control, their agency as much as possible. The choices might be crappy, right? Both choices or all three or whatever the choices are might be very limited and they might be complete crap. And yet there's still sometimes choice to choose between two crappy options. That is really important. What else do we know is helpful from people when they're looking for mental health and support? I've got three here really. I don't think any of these are going to be new to you, but sometimes we talk about them and we don't always know, well, what's the difference here? So I'm going to define them in a little bit more. So listening, not fixing. We'll talk a little bit about when might fixing be appropriate, but listening, not fixing. Then validation. So validation is really when someone has an experience or reaction and you're conveying that is completely understandable, that reaction, even though you may not agree on the facts of the situation, or you might have had a completely different reaction to that same situation. So this is important with someone who's experiencing severe mental health symptoms like psychosis, right? You may not agree with that, yes, there's a person there in the room, or this is sort of a vast conspiracy based on whatever, or that they have these special superpowers. You may not agree on those facts, right? But you can validate the emotions that they are experiencing. That's really understandable. If I was having thoughts like blah, 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 I could certainly see why I would feel really scared or I would be really angry in that situation. So it's validating someone's emotional experience. You don't have to necessarily agree on the facts. Normalization is really getting to like, yeah, this reaction is normal. Many other people might be going through the same thing or would react similarly. Like many people are really struggling with their mental health or with their substance use recovery. Because often people, especially in this pandemic, of well, why am I feeling this way? Why am I having this reaction? And it's getting away from pathologizing these. That these are normal reactions. It's uncertain. It's this unclear duration. Of course you're feeling this way. This makes a whole lot of sense, kind of thing. Now, often people can kind of skip these three because it's sort of like, yeah, Heather, like, let's get to the real stuff, right? This is the real stuff, right? Without these, we really have nothing. This is the most important stuff that you can do with someone. It can seem really basic, but it can also be so tricky when someone's really distressed right in front of you, or they're not in touch with reality, or you really disagree with their worldview, or sometimes you so badly and clearly want to fix something for them. We can't do any of that. These ones have to come first, right? If we don't have this, we really don't have anything. So then what happens? What if it's time for like, I really want to give some information or advice? This is my new favorite quote from a
Love it.
motivational interviewing webinar I went to just a couple of days ago, or I guess it was a week and a half ago, of just unsolicited advice. It's the junk mail of counseling, right? Think about junk mail. I neither want it, I neither need it. I have to accept it sort of through my home, and yet it is dismissed as quickly as possible. This is the same thing with unsolicited advice. So we want to be careful. We don't want to be the junk mail, right? We also want to be aware of information overload. So this is a time where clients are probably getting a lot of information from a lot of different sources, but also ourselves, right? I'm definitely aware of the irony here in a webinar talking about this, but you might have noticed with yourself, is there the experience to research endlessly, to attend all the trainings, right? You are already very well equipped to cope and be helpful, right? In the homelessness services sector, you're well versed in emergencies, being innovative, establishing relationships with people where they have had a lot of difficulty with relationships in the past. These are the fundamentals. You already have a lot of coping skills. And so recognize that sometimes we, of course, with the best of intentions, will want to research and get some more certainty. But often that leads us to feeling more uncertainty because we're aware of what we don't know. And so we can kind of get caught in a spiral where it's stop. You have a lot of expertise and wisdom already. And so acknowledging that and kind of noticing the tendency that we all have sometimes to underestimate our own skills and abilities. All right, so what do we do? What if there is a situation where we really think advice or information is warranted? This comes to my second favorite quote, at least for today, is that people don't care what you know until they know that you care. If you've been to AA or 12-step meetings, you've probably heard this one before, right? And it's really, until people know that you get it, they're really not interested in what problem solving or advice that you have. So then as service providers, we really need to say, mirror back our understanding in our own words, right? I might get, this is clearly what's going on, and I've got some great ideas for this person, but even though I get it, does this person in front of me know that I get it? And we don't really get that until I kind of say, all right, this is kind of what I'm hearing from you, or this is what I really am hearing, or this is what I get. This is the challenge that you're facing. We don't want to be a parrot, but we do want to summarize what I understand, what their needs, priorities, or concerns are, right? And when we get that, yes, exactly. All right, now it's time we can proceed to sharing some advice or information. So the ask, tell, ask method is what I'd really recommend anytime you have to share information. And this could be teaching someone like a harm reduction procedure, like a safer use thing, or it could be sharing just information verbally with people. The first step is asking. So asking permission, or asking like, what do you already know about coronavirus? Or what would you like to know about, say, risk of who is more vulnerable to coronavirus symptoms, that kind of thing. So you kind of have two options there. What do they want to know? What do they already know? Or, hey, I think I have something that might be really helpful in this situation. Would it be okay if I shared with you? The thing is sometimes you're going to get a no, and respect that no. Because think about if someone says no and you're like, I think this is important, and you launch into it, what's going to happen to that relationship? Right? Are they going to be more or less likely to connect with you or that service in the future, right? And if we don't have that relationship, they don't feel understood and listened to, there's not really much you can do, right? So we have to respect and know, but asking is the helpful first step to kind of open people up, give us an opportunity. Then we share that information respectfully, clearly, in small amounts, like 2 or 3 pieces of information. Because again, we have to respect people are stressed out, right? Especially if they're experiencing psychotic symptoms, that sort of thing. Their attention span is going to be less, right? So 2 or 3 pieces of information, that's sort of our ideal amount. And then the last piece, and this is the one that's often forgotten, but actually can be the most important, is asking someone, what's your reactions to what I just said? Did you have any thoughts about what I just shared with you? Or you can also use the teach back method. So the teach back method is not the, well, repeat back to me what I just said, because most of you, if you've had a healthcare professional do that to you, you can imagine what their reaction is, right? You feel really talked down to, and I know I get pretty pissed off. What this is, teach back is, hey, could you share back to me what you understood? I want to make sure that I explained it right. The onus is, did I explain this well? Not did you understand it well? The onus is on me. I'm not sure I explained it well or if I did a good job, right? So help me figure out if I did a good job here, not, hey, did you understand this? It's a real difference there. So any reactions to what I just said, or what do you make of that kind of thing? Or, hey, I want to make sure that I did a good job explaining, how to use this procedure or how to do this station at our shelter. Can you share with me? I want to make sure I did a good job on that. So that's ask, tell, ask in a nutshell. If you've had any motivational interviewing training, you might also recognize this is the elicit, provide, elicit. But in the new version of motivational interviewing, the updated text, they're now calling it ask, tell, ask. All right, so let's round out some of our other tips. So practical tips for helping is using evocation. That's just a fancy word of kind of what is someone already doing, right? During this crisis, now is not really the best time to teach people the most advanced psychological coping techniques and therapy skills if they don't have them already, right? Because again, we know how stress affects cognition. There's a lot of other stuff that's going on that might be priorities right now. Instead, we want to focus on what active, helpful coping skills are they perhaps already doing and might be minimizing or underestimating? Could they use it in, say, other areas? Also, drawing on what's helped them through other times of hardship. People who are vulnerably housed or experiencing homelessness, they've been through a lot of hardship already, right? Is there anything they've learned from those times that potentially could be used now? So I kind of gave some examples of how I might broach this, like, wow, that sounds really exhausting for you. I wonder what might be most helpful, or what's been helpful for you in the past when you've been feeling this way, or you're experiencing a lot of cravings right now. What's been successful for you when you had cravings or urges before? And that would be helpful whether someone's in recovery, where they're working on harm reduction, whatever. Also, what we know is helpful for people is really focusing on connection. With this pandemic, there's so much focus on sort of isolation. We know that can be such a risk for mental health. So really reinforcing existing supports. How can someone still connect with services, friends, loved ones, right? Also recognizing with connection that because this is an increased time of stress, this is also a time for increased conflict. If anyone here has sort of training or background on the concept of lateral violence, which is when there's sort of limited resources, often in these kinds of situations, it can become an us versus them, me versus you, where it's us versus the situation, right? And so we have to really, if we're feeling this sort of reaction of me versus you, is trying to really, it's not me versus you, it's us versus this crappy situation that we're all facing right now. This doesn't mean accept abuse, threats, or hostility, but also recognize that sometimes you as sort of a safer person can sometimes experience more of people's frustrations because you are a safer place to kind of unload. Again, not accepting of that abuse, threats, or hostility, but kind of understand where are people coming from? Why are you seeing this increase in conflict? The other thing we know from research in terms of connection and mental health is that a warm handoff for referrals is best, right? Handing someone a list of resources or handing someone a phone number, that's not as helpful as compared to, let's call this number together. Let's reach out, let's have someone, all right, you're gonna go to this online meeting, who's gonna help coach you through? Let's try this out together first. That warm handoff is more likely for someone to actually then follow up on that referral. One of the last tips I have is something called encourage self-compassion. And I was really debating whether to include this one because I feel like self-compassion can really turn very sort of shallow pop psychology-ish. But really what this is, it's about trying to speak to yourself in a way where you'd speak to a friend who's experiencing those same challenges or pain. And I think this is really important for people who are struggling with their recovery or struggling with previous coping skills, like I was trying to stockpile substances or food, but my sort of eating disorder symptoms is I ate all the food, right? Or I used all those substances, where it's like, that's the nature of a substance use disorder, is that lack of control. And so there can be a lot of frustration and then shame and guilt and sort of harsh self-talk of, why did I do this? I'm such an idiot. I should be able to do this. And what happens when you talk to yourself in that way? Any of us, we've had these experiences. We talk to ourselves in this way. We feel more guilt, more shame. And when you're feeling intense guilt, shame, and pain, what do you tend to do? You tend to rely on some of those old coping strategies, like engaging in self-harm or restricted eating or binge eating or substance use, right? So it's a way to break out of that sort of shame and sort of less helpful coping strategies spiral, right? Of instead trying to self-compassionate approach. So thinking, all right, what kind of tone of voice would I use with a friend? What words would I choose? Although we have to recognize with self-compassion, this is not something that can turn into further self-criticism of, oh, well, I should be kind to myself. I shouldn't be so harsh on myself. That can be a real challenge, right? What this is, hey, wait a second. I understand why I'm being so harsh on myself, right? This pattern makes sense. I really don't want to be engaging in this behavior anymore. I really want it to change. I'm desperate for it to change. That makes sense then why I'm being so harsh with myself. Yet, what is going to be most helpful? And the best analogy that I've kind of come up with, because often people are like, I can't be compassionate or accepting of myself when I so desperately want to change, is I ask them to think about a harsh or strict teacher that you've had in your life, right? Where if you make a mistake, it's terrible and you're kind of filled with fear with them. How much did you learn with them, right? Usually it's not that much. Usually you learned how to fake it, right? Versus now think about a helpful coach or adult in your life. And sometimes this is hard with people who have a lot of trauma histories because they may not have actually ever had a helpful coach or adult in their life. So sometimes it's just imagining that helpful coach, adult, or therapist, or kind of imagine what that would be like, where it's, again, it's not that this person doesn't have boundaries or standards. It's no big deal if you don't learn how to play baseball or learn the piano this way, but it's more if you make a mistake, it's no big deal, right? We'll figure it out and we'll keep going, right? You make a mistake in this recipe, no big deal. Let's figure it out. Let's make it again, right? Compare and contrast these harsh and strict teacher where you're kind of filled with dread and terror versus the helpful coach and adult who's accepting yet also kind of still has those high standards. Which one would you learn more with, or did you learn more with? Almost every single person will say it's the helpful coach or adult, right? That I'm actually learning, not just faking it through. And that's what self-compassion is all about, right? It's breaking out of that spiral of shame, guilt, and kind of ignoring why these things are happening, and instead saying, hey, this pattern makes sense, and yet how can I break out of it? How can I do something different?
And I like the thought about self-care and self-compassion is not something else you need to add to your list of tasks that you should be doing during this pandemic, because then it just becomes another thing that you can potentially fail at, or is another pressure on you. I really like the way that you framed that, Heather. It's about just recognizing and having some curiosity and compassion when you look at your own patterns and what you need.
Yeah, and any pattern that someone's engaging in, like, it makes a whole lot of sense. We may not like it, but there's something there that's kind of reinforcing it. So I got to kind of look at it with this curiosity, with compassion and understanding, and then that's going to help me change it rather than just ignoring, or I'm a terrible person because this is happening, where there's some reasons that it's happening, and so let's adjust. And everyone wants to be better, right? And we're just doing the best we can.
Mm-hmm.
So just other tips for helpers is, of course, it's very hard to help people when we're also distressed. So managing our own distress is important. So there was the April 1st webinar and handout for that. And also just recognizing this sort of principle of universality, right? Is we're all going through this together. It's very different compared to with many mental health things is usually I am not also going through depression while helping someone who's also depressed. I'm not also working on my recovery or experiencing challenges with substance use while also helping someone else, right? Usually we've kind of gone through it, we've learned, and then we're kind of sort of sharing that sort of back to someone. We're all going through it together. We're all going through these changes together. So kind of giving yourself a break and also recognizing that this has its own unique challenges. I also have some resources at the end in terms of other resources that are out there to help folks manage their own distress. The other thing that's really helpful, especially in the stressful work of working in the homelessness service sector, is making sure that you get a debrief and outlet. So kind of having your own, where's my emotional baggage drop off? So I have a place to kind of outlet my emotions, the moral conflicts I might have faced during this, my feelings of helplessness, my feelings of imposter syndrome, of I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm kind of just doing my best. Is this the right thing? And there may not actually be an answer for that. Of how am I going to cope with that at the end of each day? Do I have someone or some way that I can kind of unload that? The other thing I would really suggest looking at is your own information overload. So just pausing, even right now, I was especially sort of talking to folks who are helpers is, do you have any time in your day right now that's not related to learning, talking, coping with COVID-related issues, whether this is at work, but also when you come home? Is there any time in your day there that's not related to this? And then also it's helpful to think of all of us as our own hierarchy of needs, right? Our physiological needs, like, is there time for me to pee during the day? Have I had a drink of water, right? If we're not meeting those, our other things in terms of psychological needs, self-fulfillment, though we're not going to get to those and we're not going to be the most effective helpers that we can be.
And, you know, those things sound really basic, but I know what it's like, you know, serving 600 people lunch and then feeling overwhelmed because I didn't have anyone else to back me up at some points, and then needing to use the washroom, right? Those kind of things really can start to weigh on you. Or realizing that I missed lunch because there was a crisis happening that I had to jump in on. And I'm actually just hungry, which is why I'm feeling super angry and overwhelmed at this client that I'm dealing with. So,
right. It's irritating. I can hear it in my voice where I'm like, why am I being so harsh? And yet I can't sometimes help it. It's just coming out. And it's like, yeah, because I haven't eaten anything all day. I haven't had a drink. And actually, yeah, I really need to pee. And I haven't, it's been like 6 hours, right?
yeah.
Because there's always crises where it's like, but I'm going to add fuel to the fire if I also don't take even just a couple moments of those little basic moments to take some time for myself. Some tips for managers is being really clear regarding the limits of your services. So what can clients expect to receive? And we want, of course, to support staff to be innovative because I think that is sort of what we're used to, right? We're used to going without, to go above and beyond, to fill gaps because the resources, they just don't exist for us, and they don't work for our clients. And yet also recognizing we can't be everything to everyone either, right? This is going to be a recipe for burnout, a recipe for complaints, and we can also make things much worse for the people that we serve because there's a lack of clarity, because there can really set it up for disappointment, right? And then collaborating with other service providers. How can we divide and conquer? We don't want to reinvent the wheel here. What resources potentially could we share, even if it's just knowledge resources as well? And so HSABC is a good example of this too. In terms of resources for clients, I'll be completely honest, I really struggled with this because in this pandemic, a lot of the mental health resources are now online. And not everyone's going to have access to internet, or the way that they accessed internet previously was through, say, public Wi-Fi spots or the library, and those are all closed to people right now. So I do have sort of the basic ones here that, like, many recovery meetings, like Smart Recovery, Life Ring, 12-step, those are all online. But I'm actually not sure what's going to be best for your clients and in your region. And so that's where it might be something to kind of create in-house what is available locally, because there are different helping Facebook groups and other things, and could there be a list that might be developed there? In terms of resources for helpers, the Mental Health Commission of Canada has a number of really interesting and different resources. So help for how to talk to someone in crisis, caregiving in the era of coronavirus, and also some mental health first aid resources. Psychological first aid is also really interesting. This may or may not be within the scope of your service, but it's kind of how to help people with mental health crises. It's sort of short term. It's not therapy. It's more sort of a first response. And there's some training, and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org, they have many different resources there. PHSA also has a disaster psychological response team as well that is helping people with this. The last ones for helpers in terms of helping yourself and managing your own distress is the BC Psychological Association is providing free first aid sessions for frontline workers where you can have, say, a 30-minute session with a psychologist, a registered psychologist. There's also the Starling Minds online coping program that has, it's about 6 sessions. You can kind of do it self-paced and has a lot of videos and is quite interactive. And
That's
for managers,
that they're offering free first aid. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think it's pretty neat as well. And last I heard from them is I think they hadn't had too much demand on service, so I think they're quite willing and able to kind of really meet people. And it's, you get a call back like within a very short amount of time. It's not sort of here, I'll hear back in a week. Like it's within a matter of hours or less that you get your phone call back. There is this Interagency Standing Committee briefing note on mental health and psychosocial support during coronavirus. It's for a general health population. It's not specific to homeless populations, but I thought the general population info was still interesting. And then there's the BC guidance on psychosocial well-being of healthcare providers. So this might be helpful for your staff, to know for your staff. And then the last thing before we get to our question period is I'm really stealing this quote from this psychologist, Anita Gupta, where she was really talking about in this pandemic, like we don't know what is coming, right? We've got to accept this uncertainty. And yet we also have to accept that we have a lot of coping skills and resources and abilities already that, again, we all have a tendency to underestimate, right? So whatever happens, right, we're going to meet this, and we're going to meet this together. And to remind ourselves of this, I think, is really, really important. So then I thought I'd open it up to questions or just discussion.
Yeah. Do you feel comfortable going on video today, Heather?
Sure. Let me turn on my camera.
I know I actually just listened to an amazing poem by Kate Tempest, and it was about how beautiful people's faces are. And I think I've been missing that.
Just seeing people.
Yeah, and I realize there's a lot of emotion coming up for me when I see my friends, 6 feet away or down the boardwalk or whatever. Oh, wow, I look strange right now. There we go. There's emotion coming up for me, oh, I can see you, but I can't touch you. I can't hug you. I can't just hang out or sit together with you. And obviously that's not a challenge when you're in frontline work. In fact, it's very stressful because there's a lot of people in your space at a time.
I am seeing you. I am touching you.
Yeah. When you don't want that closeness. So I recognize that as well. But I think in terms of, maybe our loved ones, especially if you're frontline and you're isolating from your family right now. We have a public health nurse who works with us who has a daughter who's immunocompromised. So he's been living in his garage for a month, and because he's working on the front line and helping people, but then also trying to protect his family. So we'll just wait for some questions to come in here. I just want to say thank you. There was so much richness in what you shared, even in terms of the depth of understanding how people are handling things, like what their reasoning is. And we've had a lot of questions come up in the past about how hard it is to enforce things like hand washing or social distancing. We had a story yesterday of someone, a worker in a homeless camp, walking by a tent and seeing 4 people inside the tent sharing a joint and feeling really frustrated because, there's this heightened threat and yet people aren't, quote unquote, taking it seriously. But I just found it really helpful to think about the hierarchy of needs and also previous trauma and what else might be going on for them that is guiding their reaction to what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I try my best, and I'm sure other people have probably other insights and expertise because they know the clients that they work with best. But sometimes it's, what I see as important, again, is not necessarily what others people see as important. And that doesn't necessarily mean that mine is right and theirs is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a real challenge. And I think it's also a challenge where I want to control other people's behaviors. And it's not that we don't have influence over other people's behavior, but ultimately, we also don't have control, right? We can influence sometimes, but we don't get to control it. And that is really hard, especially when it's something we care about, like safety, like helping others, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and actually I was thinking about how you're speaking about control in terms of addictions and recovery. And that's a very important thing to learn if you're in frontline work, and it took me a long time to learn it. And that is, there's so much research out there and things that tell us we know better. We know how to manage someone's recovery. And sometimes when they're under the influence of a substance or in the midst of a mental health crisis, we assume that they're not in control at all. And so what happens is we sometimes step in there and try to take over because we want to help, because we want to save them, because we want to fix things. And that's a natural human thing to do. But it was really helpful just to have you clarify. I think there was one point where you just said, people are going to say no sometimes to our advice. But when your whole job is providing care and help and food and shelter, and there's rules around that, it's very hard to actually sit back and do that listening piece or say, what do you need right now?
Yeah, I agree. I find sometimes it's almost like I have this steam train in my mind of like, I've loaded everything up. I'm ready. I'm ready with these brilliant insights and this is going to be perfect. And then you get a no and you're like, but no, my train has left the station kind of thing. I've got some brilliant insight for you where, one, it may not be that brilliant. We know from research what is important even in a therapy session, what a therapist thinks is the most important stuff is not usually aligning with what the client has said is the most important stuff.
Yeah.
And I think one thing, again, I really value my motivational interviewing training, where often we can use language in helping services like, oh, they're non-compliant, or they're in denial, or that kind of thing, where it's really like we disagree about priorities, right? We disagree about goals, right? Because who's to say what someone should do to comply, right? We know, okay, and even that term compliance, right, has a very paternalistic of one person's the expert and one person should be adhering to something else, right? Of kind of, yes, we know these are the recommendations, but there are also maybe very important reasons why someone's not following those directions, or they don't see that as a priority or importance. And I think sometimes we launch into, oh, well, it's because they don't have the information. I'll just give the information. They may have the information. It's actually about priorities, right? And or risk. And that's actually what we really need to understand and get.
Yeah, I was thinking about a scenario where either people are not accessing shelter services or they've been out, in Stanley Park camping out, trying to isolate. That's a big park here in Vancouver where a lot of people camp. But now, they might need some safe supply, or they might need some medical help, or they might just be coming back into the system. And so there's a couple things there. One is that they might not know the extent of the public health orders or the latest data or the latest recommendations, because they don't have internet, and they also have been staying away from people. So when they come back into your shelter setting, you can perceive that as a threat, right? Because you don't know where they've been or who they've been in contact with. And they also are not well versed in the stringent protocols that we've been setting up and other clients might be used to. So you get a screening when you come in the door. You have to always wash your hands. There isn't enough space for everybody because we've reduced the number of beds. Or, for an example, our cafeteria is now closed. We just give food out at the door, and you have to stand in a long line, and you have to stand 6 feet apart from someone. So for somebody who's been out isolating in a park in a tent, they're coming back in maybe because they need human contact. Maybe they need news, but they could just be overwhelmed by the amount of things that have changed since they've engaged last with your service. And it just, the way that you were speaking about it, I just really see so much compassion in the tools that you've given us. Yes, we are under these directives. Yes, we want to save lives. Yes, it is very important for us to maintain physical distancing, to encourage hand washing, to do screening. All of these things are very crucial, as Dr. Danielle Ben-Smith told us yesterday from the BC Health Authority. However, we know from our relational training and the fact that a lot of people engage with our services because they need family, or we are their family, or we are trusted people to them because they've been traumatized by the system. They might have other needs that are competing. So their biggest need is not, am I going to get sick? It's, can I connect? Does anybody see me? Will I be safe? Can I get the information I need? So that was kind of a long rambling thing, but yeah.
But I think it gets to the, someone comes back in, they have this expectation of what perhaps your service is like based on their previous experience. And now the service has changed. Much like any of us, if I'm expecting to say, go to my doctor's office or access the hospital, and I'm expecting it to be like this because that's how it's always been. And now all of a sudden it's changed. I don't know why it's changed. It's changed in ways that seem arbitrary and completely useless to me. Who among us would not be really frustrated with that? Right? Who among us wouldn't be like, actually, I'm going to test these boundaries because I think these boundaries are kind of BS, and is that actually a boundary, right? And I don't get it, and it doesn't make any sense. And are you maybe actually, you are just like everybody else in my previous experiences. I thought you were different, but maybe you're not, right? Yeah. And so it's kind of having to fall back on that relationship and be transparent, and kind of understand where someone's coming at, validate, normalize their emotions as much as you can. Maybe it might not be right in that moment, right? Sometimes people are too upset and angry in that moment, but can you then reconnect again?
It reminds me actually of a while ago, I had an anxiety attack when I was driving to an appointment, and I was so elevated. I also had run out of money on my credit card because I just had a bad month, and I was trying to find parking to get to my important appointment. And I couldn't park because I couldn't pay for it. And then I didn't know where to park for free, but I had this super important appointment. And I remember just panicking and feeling overwhelmed, and that I was alone in an unfamiliar setting. I did find a free parking spot, and as I was walking to my appointment, I had a little bit of time, and there was this cafe. I'd never been there before. It was in part of the city I'd never been to, but everything in my body was just like, oh, thank God, somewhere to get a cup of coffee and something to eat, and then everything will be okay. So I walked in there, and I'd never been in that setting before, and they had a really weird way of lining up. And immediately people were really grumpy with me because I was already elevated, already anxious, already overwhelmed. And I just wanted some food and something to drink and a safe place to calm myself. And people were giving me a vibe that was like, you're not welcome here, you don't know what's going on, you don't know how the rules work. Well, obviously I don't, because I've never been there before. And I had no idea what was going on. And my basic need for comfort, food, and shelter were being compromised. And so even, I haven't experienced the kind of trauma that a lot of our clients have, but that was just a hard day for me, and I was in that place myself.
Yeah, yeah, and probably one of those, if you had just one of those stressors, you probably would have been able to cope just fine,
Yeah.
right? But they kind of loaded, and they had the sort of the trigger stacking, where now it's like I can't deal with any of them because they're all at once, and I can't take it, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, it makes it so hard, and it's just like I feel so helpless, and like I just want to give up. And I think sometimes when people come into our service, we don't know what has happened to them previously during their day. Did they even sleep last night? What are their voices like, right? All those different things that we're not even aware of. We just see someone who's having this huge reaction, which to us seems very out of proportion to the situation. And yet we're not aware of everything else and how they're kind of escalating up that emotion thermometer, where they didn't come in at a 0, right? And actually maybe they're never 0 because of their PTSD, because of other mental health symptoms. They actually came in at an 80, and this one last thing was like, that was too much.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we got some questions. That's good. So this is someone talking about how their biggest challenge currently in their role is not being able to support their clients with maintaining spaces and apartments in terms of maintaining cleanliness. So they're a caseworker, they're part of their job is to help people in their living situations, because they're not allowed to meet with them in person and support them side by side. So do you have tips? I know you're dealing with this right now in your own practice. Do you have tips for how to support clients with doing their own tasks? So in this case, it's cleaning, but it could be recovery. It could be some other pieces without you being physically there to support them, especially with clients with some kind of cognitive challenge.
So is this person, it's tough, right? If there was an easy answer, this person would have already fixed it, right? This person's meeting virtually with clients or via phone?
I think, yeah, I'm not sure. It just says they can't be there with them to support their housing, where they're living, as being a clean, organized space.
Right, right. So perhaps this person's maybe working on like one of the hoarding task forces or something like that.
Yeah, or
Okay.
helping people with cognitive challenges, just sort of do the daily life.
Okay. I'm going to come to cognitive challenges second, so don't let me forget it. I'll talk just a little bit as sort of the more support when you're not physically present. And the clear goal is sort of supporting them with kind of cleanliness and stuff. My focus would be on, one is maintaining contact with you as a service provider, right, during this time of stress, which sounds really basic, like, of course we're going to do that. But you want to make sure people don't drop out of treatment, right? So that when you are able to be physically present with them, that they actually are still part of the service, right? So they don't get disheartened of, oh, the service is useless, that kind of thing. So maintaining that relationship would be first. And so I'd really talk to them of like, well, what is your goal? What do you think might be most doable in the next week, right? If we think about sort of our overall goal together is we're working towards this. So being very clear with them around what's our roadmap again? This is what we're working on together. What is just one step that you think in the next week or next 2 weeks, whatever the appointment time a window is, that would help you make progress towards blank? And get them to generate that as much as possible. If they're like, really, I have no idea, that's why I'm asking you kind of thing, I'm going to be like, well, let's brainstorm together. And then I might do an ask, tell, ask. Well, hey, would you be interested? I have 2 or 3 ideas that, might have been helpful for other people. And then I'd give them, 2 or 3 ideas and then say, and perhaps maybe you came up with something even better while I was talking there. What do you think? What would be doable? All right, and then kind of using those people, I think most folks are familiar with SMART goals, so making it really specific, realistic? What do you think will get in the way? What are challenges that you might experience? And just focusing, can you do one thing, right? It's kind of turning cliff faces into staircases, right? If we look at this cliff face, this huge goal, often we get disheartened. That's so big, I'm never going to get there, so we never even start, right? So what's one thing where maybe it's not where I want to be, but it would make me a little bit closer, right? I think of me right now as I still have not done my taxes, and it is a huge cliff face for me. But what I've done is I'm like, all right, 30 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day, I will work on my taxes. And that I can do, because I can do 30 minutes. But at the end of the day, it's 7 o'clock, I'm exhausted. I'm not going to work 2 to 3 hours on my taxes, so then I get nothing done. 30 minutes is better than no minutes, right? And so with our clients, it's trying to turn things into really manageable goals, getting them to tell us what's most important and them to break it down, what's really feasible, and then kind of assisting them with that.
That's good. That's good. And then the cognitive piece?
Yeah, it would depend if you know, because I know most of the time working in these sectors, we don't know, is I would be like, can you connect with the OT or in their file? What is the type of cognitive challenge, right? Is it a language one? Is it memory? Is it concentration? And then adjust based on that, because the strategies for helping someone with cognitive challenges are different depending on what the cognitive challenge is, right? If it's more memory based, then it's kind of figuring out sort of reminders, can there be supports for that? If it's organization and planning, then I'd support them differently on that. So yeah, I think my challenge with the recommendations there is it depends on what are the cognitive challenges that someone faces. In general, many people find, say, especially if we're doing things verbally, repetition is helpful, because the second I say words, they disappear, right? So repetition summaries are helpful for people, but of course you have to assess that also can be really frustrating if you don't have memory challenges, right? So I think I would adjust a little bit there depending on what are the cognitive challenges, and hopefully you have a bit of guidance there on what the cognitive challenges are.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Heather. And I think, it comes back to something that I see as a thread throughout this entire presentation, and that is relationship. And that's where, again, we as frontline workers have a strength, and some of us that might be a hidden strength. But actually, I can think of at least 5 people in my experience working frontline that had a strong relationship with me and would come to me for advice and information or help. And so there are ways that we can lean into that. Sometimes that can be overwhelming, but in this moment right now, the idea of just maintaining that relationship with your clients if you can't see them. So making time in your schedule to check in with them on an agreed upon time every week. And it might not be that you accomplish any goals, but the main goal is to maintain that connection so that people feel like someone is rooting for them, that they do have a safe place to come to deal with what's going on for them.
Yeah, I think we can sometimes really minimize this of like, yeah, of course, I got to get to these other things. That's going to be, again, the real therapy or the real intervention of I got to get to those, where it's like we can sometimes push too hard to, say, get on the organization or the employment or whatever that goal is. We push too hard on that. We lose the relationship, and then we have no relationship with the client, and then they're not benefiting at all because they're not even there, right? They've disconnected of you are like the other folks. And I think we can sometimes underestimate how healing a relationship can be of just, hey, I can actually potentially trust you, and maybe I can connect with you, because even that connection with you will then hopefully translate onto other services that hopefully they will need and access as well. So that relationship, we can say, oh yeah, we take it for granted, but it is the keystone of everything.
So we have a few minutes here, and I think the sense that I get is that people are processing, which is good. But maybe I'll just ask the question to everybody on the line, and if you feel comfortable, please type in. If you don't, that's fine. But number one is, how are you feeling right now? With the pandemic, or with your work, or even in this moment around this webinar, what's coming up for you? And then the other question, if you don't want to answer that one, would be, what's your greatest challenge in helping your clients right now? So just take a minute there. I know for me right now, I'm at the place where I don't want to know anymore. But I'm also at the place of frustration that I still have big feelings and I still have coping mechanisms that aren't healthy. So it's exactly as you described. There's a place of, I really want to change these things, but I also have no more room for new advice or strategies or anything. So that's an interesting place to be, because you both want to change, but you also, there's so much information out there right now about what we should be doing as care providers, and even, break it down to family, like what I should be doing for my kids, what I should be doing at home, what kind of exercise routine I need to have to be healthier. Like there's this huge, social media in particular can be overwhelming for seeing other people baking bread and doing aerobics and all of that kind of stuff. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Yeah, I bet other folks are at similar things. And I think it also depends. I feel like the pressures are a little bit different for people who are not working from home versus the people who are. I feel like there's a bit of a divide there of what pressures people are feeling too.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for sharing. I'm just going to sort of summarize these a little bit. The big one is uncertainty. So nobody's telling us when things are going to be back to normal, and because we don't know, and there's no plan that's being communicated about how that's going to look. And that's a really hard one. Wishing there was a plan or guidance in place to eventually be up and running again. This other big one that you kind of touched on in terms of burnout is feeling drained and compassion fatigued. So it's really hard to support clients when you can't meet with them in person, or you can't connect in the way that you did before with your services. And again, this is echoed by someone else who's saying, just feeling overwhelmed. The greatest challenge is how to ensure communication of care and respect for those they serve while maintaining all of the distancing measures. It's very difficult to do the work that we do while following public health recommendations and all of the other things that are being asked of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. And I think sometimes other people may have other ideas and suggestions of what they find works for them. For me, sometimes I find just acknowledging that of like, hey, it's really weird to be having a phone call right now when I'm used to seeing you in person, or like, I know this is not our usual sort of session. How I'm thinking again, that person who's working on the sort of clutter and stuff, this is not how we usually operate. And, I'm not really liking this right now. I feel like I don't know how you're reacting. I feel like I'm not being all that helpful to you. This is tough, right? And kind of just saying like, this is what's happening in the room, right? And acknowledging that sometimes with clients of like, this is not how I usually operate, or, how we're used to interacting with each other. And I'm kind of feeling like this is kind of sucky right now. What about you? Of just kind of humanizing and kind of going with that principle of universality. And it can kind of almost take the, I want to say the wind out of the room, but that's definitely not the right phrase. I don't know. You point out the elephant in the room and it almost makes it a bit easier to deal with.
Well, I really loved, we have a friend in England who's a priest, and he's doing services online, and he posted the latest one, and he said, if you don't feel awkward, you're not doing it right. I thought, oh yeah, that's a good way to name that.
Yeah. It's normalizing, right? And it's validating of, I don't like this. I don't feel I'm being all that helpful here. And yet, of course, makes sense why I'm feeling that way, right? I've got this weird block, and this is not how I'm used to operating. And it's probably not even the ideal way of operating and offering these services. Otherwise, we would have been doing that already, right?
Yeah. And there's a comment here about just that general thing that we carry as frontline workers, as people who care and help, is that worry, about who's falling through the cracks and who we're not seeing. It's very hard in a regular health crisis, the fentanyl crisis, public service crisis, all of these things, but then to add corona on top of it, the level of worry for how people are going to make it is huge, I think. And it's a hard one to manage when you're seeing it every day, when you're seeing it happen. Do you have any tips on how to manage that level of worry? I ask you all the hard questions, don't I?
And I think it's almost like that's the worry that we're aware of in our mind, but it's like, but what's behind that worry, right? Because it's kind of like, am I worried because I haven't seen, Joe? Is that because Joe's self-isolating? Is that because Joe may be used by himself and overdosed? Is that because, Joe's in the hospital with corona? Is that because, and so like, what is the basis of my fears? Or is Joe, he needs help and he just can't access it because our service is now restricted hours, or he can't get in and the line's too long, or, sometimes it's like, yeah, this is tough, right? And I wish, again, it's like I could say, guys, this is going to be 6 months and we're going to be done, right? But this is a marathon, and it's even with a marathon, at least it's like 40K and then you're done, right? There is no halfway point. And I think more's coming out of like, can we expect a surge? Probably. Will there be multiple surges? Probably. And again, what is normalcy going to look like? And I guess my only thoughts and suggestions are kind of, we're all going through this together. And I know it's not helpful often to be, when people are like, we're going to make it through, but also is don't underestimate your coping strategies either. And we don't know how we're going to make it through. And this sucks, right? This sucks. And I think we all wish this wasn't happening. And I wish I was not giving this webinar today, and yet we're here, right? And it sucks, and it's this unknown marathon length, and yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense. And I wish there was some thing that I could say of like, this is how you fix it, or this is how you reframe your thinking. And if it was that simple, we would have thought of it already.
Yeah. Thank you for just acknowledging that. I think that we're trained to be looking for solutions, and we're trained to find ideas and research, and we're trained for the fix, especially in this line of work. And although it's very hard, because like I remember in one setting I worked in, it was overwhelming, and the only way that I could cope mentally with going back to work every day was to think about all the positive things about my work. And then when I left that setting and I'd go through that neighborhood on the bus, it was so hard because I saw all the things that I'd been blocking out so I could actually go to work every day. Because if I thought about all of the hardships that were happening around me every day, I wouldn't be able to do my job. And so there's a sense where, I just want to say, it's important to say that it sucks sometimes.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, I don't want to be numb and unfeeling, but I can't be raw and feel everything.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I don't know where is the right level. I don't want to be the unfeeling, sort of burnt out person where we've kind of all either seen them or experienced them, and perhaps as a service user, I don't want to be that person. And yet I also need to emotionally and mentally survive this. And I can't feel all the things all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're in this service sector, you're a feeling and caring person because this is why you went into the sector. And it's kind of like, what is the right level? And there is no right level, right? Everybody's going to be different. And I think it also changes over the course of your career, and it changes over different situations. And it's tough. It's really tough. The work is really important, and it's also really effing hard.
Yeah. So we do have some more questions here, which is great. A quick and easy one is the psychological first aid service that you shared on the resource page. Is that just for professionals, or is it a version available to share with clients?
Just for professionals. I don't believe clients would be able to access it. I think it's you could go on the website and double check. And I'm not sure how do they confirm who is a frontline professional or not. But my impression is it is for people who are sort of working in the front lines kind of thing and not clients specifically.
Yeah. And then there's a question here around evidence, especially during a pandemic, talking about nurses and doctors, but also frontline workers, about the PTSD that usually comes after a pandemic. And you're in the hospital setting right now as a psychologist. Can you speak to anything around this being acknowledged or planned for in terms of frontline workers? Because there's a lot of talk about doctors and nurses being affected.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard anything around this?
In terms of what is the likelihood of people developing PTSD, or just like what resources are available for people to prevent developing PTSD?
I think just what's your sense out there around resources being developed or plans being made around PTSD for frontline workers?
Okay. I know plans are definitely happening, right? I can't certainly speak on behalf of any health authority about what they are doing. I'll just speak on sort of my impression is that resources are being developed. And I think, again, this is totally my personal opinion, again, not reflecting any health authority. My impression has been first is focusing on, do people have PPE? How are we going to do services? How do we make sure people are safe, right? It's kind of like hierarchy of needs, right? Of the physical safety and health and well-being first, and that now many of those plans are in place. So I think many different services are now thinking, okay, now let's look at the psychological needs and develop that. And how can we meet people where they're at, right? People are at different shifts, they're rotating shifts. We need, are they going to do it while they're on shift? Not, what kind of services are required? And I think part of that has come out. The psych first aid is really a big one. And that is sort of the more recommendation based on the evidence of helping prevent PTSD, is that the psych first aid is really sort of that first line. So that's what a lot of services, is my impression, are working on developing. Then I notice, just as a psychologist across sort of our listserv, there's a number of online resources. So Starling Mind is one that's come out. There's a couple others that I'm aware of, or workbooks that sort of people are developing. Starling Minds is much more interactive, where I find the other ones, they might be a bit higher level, and it's more just, here's a web page of notes, where it's very dry and it's a bit hard to kind of read through. As a psychologist, I'm like, this is great content, but it's not really the best mode of delivery. It's not really taking in online learning. It's more just, here are the notes that you can read. So I think those are going to be further developed, and I think a lot of different counselors of BC, I think they're also working on things. I think things are coming in development, but people are making sure, are we going to make sure we deliver it safely within legislation, protect confidentiality, what virtual platform are we going to use, how long is the service that we're going to provide, that sort of thing. So I think they're in development.
Yeah, and I will say you did kind of touch on this in your presentation, and that is that making the space to debrief, and the space to have places where you can talk about your work in a way that doesn't impact your standing at your work. So finding somebody who might be in a different organization but doing the similar kind of work to you. Maybe you have friends that you run into on the street when you're doing outreach or in the camps or whatever, and you actually make a Zoom call with them on a regular basis where you say, hey, is it okay if we just talk about how our week went? Because I know there are lots of stories that happen to me in my frontline work that I cannot talk about with my friends and family who are not in the work, because they will be horrified or stressed out or really upset. Whereas for me, a way of coping with that is to see how hilarious parts of the situation were, or how wild it was, but that's just a way that I process. And so finding those people that you can laugh about your day with, making sure you do have that outlet is really important. And that, I think that debriefing is really key. And it's harder to do when we're social isolating, but there are ways to even find someone in your workplace who you trust and get along with, and make a regular check-in. It doesn't have to be a huge therapy session. It can be like, hey, do you have 10 minutes to talk about what happened today? It was super wild. I don't know how you felt about it, but I just need to talk about it. And oftentimes that can offset burnout, and not entirely, but symptoms of PTSD and burnout, because you're actually getting that stuff out in a way that is healthy.
Someone is feeling heard. You didn't have to give them all sort of the background each time of, well, this is how we typically do things and blah, blah. It's just someone gets it and you feel heard. And we also know from even trauma survivors, is what is usually the most important thing is feeling heard, right? If they're so used to kind of keeping secrets and not sharing, and will, this damage people if I actually tell them what's really going on, and that it's really important to feel heard, and like, yeah, someone has bared witness to your experience. Mm-hmm. So having an outlet to do that is important.
Yeah, and I didn't even look at the time. I was enjoying our conversation and the questions that came in. So we're at the end of our time together. Heather, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All of our stuff, all of the handouts, all of that avalanche of information is up available on our website in the coronavirus sector resources. You can find the first psychological coping there, as well as the handouts, and then this video will be up probably in the next day or two for you to take a look at if you weren't able to join us for the whole time. And if you want to call us, get in touch with us, send us an email, let us know what kind of things you need right now, any feedback you have. That's what we're here for. So Heather, once again, thank you so much. People are commenting right now about how phenomenal today was and how thankful they are for you. So thank you for taking the time to prepare this material, to think through it, and also to join us on the line today.
Thank you so much again. It's always an honor to work with you folks.
Yeah. All right. Well, take care, everyone. Stay safe, stay calm, have courage, and see you again soon. Take care.